All right, well, we'll get started. Thank you very much to our helpers handing out the note sheets. But the structure for this morning's Bible study mirrors what we did 2 weeks ago when we compared the crucifixion to the story of the bronze serpent. And today we're going to do the same thing, just with the different stories. So now we're focusing on the empty tomb, the resurrection, and we're going to see how the story of Jonah being in the belly of the great fish for 3 days and 3 nights, we're going to see how that points to Jesus' resurrection as well. So we're going to do a lot of reading the resurrection account from Matthew. We're going to read 2 chapters from Jonah, and then we're going to spend some time again doing an exercise where we compare the 2 stories, the 2 narratives, to see these similarities and connections that we can make. So we'll start off in Matthew 28, verses 1 through 15 with our resurrection text. So you can open up your Bibles, follow along, and I'll read for us. It reads, "Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the woman, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek justice, or you seek Jesus for who was crucified. He is not here, for he is risen, as he said. Come see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you.' So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, 'Greetings.' And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, 'Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me.' While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'Tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day." All right, so also in the book of Matthew, we have the specific place, the account where Jesus makes this connection himself, from the sign of Jonah to himself being in the tomb for 3 days. So that's in Matthew 12, going back more than a couple chapters, Matthew 12, verses 38 to 42. And we'll read this as well. This section is titled "The Sign of Jonah," starting at verse 38. "Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, 'Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you.' But he answered them, 'An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign. But no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here. So just a little bit of the context in surrounding Jesus talking about this sign is that the scribes and the Pharisees, the Jewish people, they're demanding a sign from Jesus to prove that he's the Messiah, to prove that these claims he's making are really true. And in doing so, they really are betraying themselves. They're showing their unbelief. The Bible throughout tells us that we shouldn't put God to the test. We shouldn't demand things from God because as creatures, that's not our place. But this is what the scribes and Pharisees are doing. So in this sign that Jesus gives, there's also this judgment and condemnation against the people asking for it. Because he says that the men of Nineveh who repented, they will be there at Judgment Day, and they too will look at the Jewish people that didn't believe Jesus when he was there in person during his ministry, and they will condemn them because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And Jesus says, behold, something greater than Jonah is here. He's talking about himself. He is the thing that is greater than Jonah. He's the greatest of all the prophets. And then also in verse 42, the queen of the south, this is the queen of Sheba that went to Solomon because of his great wisdom. She too will rise up at the judgment and condemn them because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And behold, something greater than Solomon is here. That something greater is Jesus. Jesus has more wisdom than even Solomon did, who is the wisest man to ever live, given that gift by God. And we'll see this too in the story of Jonah, that this sign is one both of judgment, but also of grace. We see how the great fish has elements of both law and gospel. It's a judgment on Jonah, but it also becomes the vehicle of his salvation. So let's move to Jonah now. Jonah chapters 1 and 2. If you have the ESV Study Bible, it's 1478. It's a pretty short book, so it's easy to miss. It starts at 1480. So before we read the first two chapters, just a note on when we look at Old Testament allegory, is that Christ is the key to interpreting Scripture. All right, so I've said this a couple times in Bible studies. It's always good to review. All things in the Old Testament point forward to the cross, and all things in the New Testament point back to the cross. So Jesus is the focus of the whole story of the Bible. The whole big picture points to him. And we can call that a Christocentric meta-narrative. And that's a big $5 word, but all it means when you break it down is Christocentric, Christ-centered, and meta just means big. A narrative is a story. So a Christ-centered big story. The big story of the Bible. All of the different accounts, the big picture always points to Jesus. Now, of course, some of the specific stories and different events, within it, they can have different focuses and different intentions. But when you put it all together, it's all leading up to Jesus, and it's all pointing back. And a good way to kind of picture this is, here you have the Old Testament. The cross is coming, and the events of the Old Testament occur, and then here comes the cross. And the cross reaches back into history. And all of these things that have occurred, we're able to see it in a new light for what it really is. It's revealed to us how all of these things were signs of what was to come. How even, the story of Jonah being in the belly of the fish, that pointed to the resurrection. And because we see through the cross, looking back, we're able to see how Jonah points to Jesus. So when we do this, we're not using Jesus as some, outside lens that is an imposition on the text. Jesus is actually, he is the Word. So he's baked in to the text. He is a part of it. He is it. So it's not something foreign that we're imposing on it. And when we interpret the Old Testament, we also don't have to exclude Jesus or keep him separate, because the power of the cross reaches back into time and it reveals to us what was already there to begin with. So a good example of this that I like to use is we're kind of being archaeologists. So we're digging away at the dirt. The archaeologist is trying to find the fossils, the bones, and what we're doing is we're digging away at the text, and we're seeing Jesus revealed to us, and he was always there to begin with, and the cross is what reveals that to us. And we're on especially solid ground when Jesus is the one that makes this connection himself. That kind of gives us the license to kill, so to speak. Jesus makes this connection. Now we're off to the races, because we know if Jesus does this, we're at a good place to do this endeavor as well. All right, so with that in mind, now we'll read through Jonah chapters 1 and 2. So at the beginning, here it reads, "Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, 'Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me.' But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went on board to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, and had laid down, and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, 'What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God.' Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish." And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid, and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And the Lord appointed, God provided, a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And here in chapter 2, we'll keep going, is Jonah's prayer, which is too often overlooked. Chapter 2, his prayer is just this great dialogue with God. Just gives a great look into what Jonah is thinking at this point. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the belly of the fish, saying, "I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the flood surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. So there's a couple cool things to note in Jonah's prayer. First, in verse 2, the very end of verse 2, right before verse 3, he talks about how out of the belly of Sheol I cried. Now, Sheol is a nuanced term that's used in the Old Testament. And it's used in multiple ways. Many ways it's used to the kind of the place of hell as we understand it, a place of destruction where the souls of the wicked go, who are in this intermediate stage where they're awaiting the final judgment day. But it can also be referred to the realm of the dead as a whole, where all mankind has to go to, both the wicked and the righteous. Although for the righteous, it's not a place of judgment, it's a place of paradise where we await the resurrection, we await Judgment Day. But it can also be used in situations like this, where it's a righteous person, a prophet. David uses this term as well. And in this case, when they refer to Sheol, it would be suffering through a trial, suffering through a great tribulation that even can come from God, a thing of discipline against one of God's disciples, against a believer. So there's kind of two interpretations of this, that either Jonah is using this as a figure of speech, that it refers to just this great trial that he's going through, just the despair that he has. But it also could possibly mean that the great fish really does take him down to the realm of the dead, that it really does have this separation from him and God. And there's room for both interpretations. I kind of like the latter, that Jonah really is taken down into death, because it kind of adds some weight to the situation, but both could be true. And what also is interesting is that there was another ancient Near East myth around this time, where it depicted this story where someone traveled down to the realm of the dead, and that it took 3 days and 3 nights for this to occur. That's how long it takes to get to Sheol. But in this story, there's a reverse, where Jonah immediately, he's taken down to Sheol in the belly of the fish, and we see at the end, where the fish vomits him out, spits him out, there's a reverse where Jonah is taken down to the depths, but then God saves him. The fish comes back up, and it would be 3 days it would take for the fish to return to dry land, to spit him out. So we see how this the fish is this vehicle of both judgment against Jonah, but is also a vehicle of salvation. And we know that the fish, it wasn't just any coincidence that this happened. It wasn't just by chance. The Bible says that God provided this fish. There's specifically God's handiwork behind this. Normally, if you were swallowed by an animal, you'd be dead, right? You could see how this would be a bad thing. So in that aspect, it conveys the law, the condemnation against Jonah. This is not a good thing. You're probably going to die. But through God's mercy, through the gospel, something that was bad, getting eaten by an animal, becomes the very thing that saves Jonah. If Jonah was at the bottom of the sea by himself, he was going to die too, because he's going to drown. But now God saves him through this animal, through Jonah being swallowed up by the fish. And eventually he spits him out, and Jonah decides to do what God has asked him to obey. And unfortunately, at the end of the story, we see that Jonah is a man, he's a sinner, and he keeps going back and forth. And unfortunately, his resolve to do the right thing, which pleases God, doesn't last throughout the whole story. But this theme of death to life is very important, especially in relating it to Jesus' death and resurrection. And this even applies to ourselves as with the life of the Christian. I'll just spoil the end of my Bible study right now, because why not? This is also the baptism that we all partake in. In baptism, the old man, the old Adam, is drowned, is killed. We kill the sin within us. And through that, we have new life as a new creation. The Holy Spirit lives in us. We have a regenerate heart, and we're actually righteous in God's eyes, and we're actually able to go out and do the things that please God. So we are dying to live. From death, we have new life. So before we do our exercise of comparing the great fish in Jesus' tomb, three questions to consider when we make these connections. And we've looked at these before in Bible studies, but good to review them as always. So number one is, am I interpreting this allegory in the right direction? So in this direction, we would start with Jesus' tomb, we would move to the belly of the fish, and then finally to you. And we want to keep this in the right direction because it helps us avoid unwanted errors. And here's an example of going in the wrong direction. So in the wrong direction, you could say that, okay, well, Jonah, he was in the belly of the fish, and he was alive in there. So that must mean that Jesus, he didn't really die on the cross. He was also alive in the tomb for 3 days, and he never really died. Okay, that would be moving in the wrong direction, and you come to a wrong conclusion. Number two, is this connection helpful and edifying for Christian teaching by pointing me to Jesus? All right? Is Jesus the center of our focus? Is it Christocentric? So an example of breaking number two is, let's say that we look at this story of Jonah and Jesus, being in the fish, being in the tomb for 3 days, and we apply this to our own lives and say, well, Jonah was going through this really bad trial and tribulation, and, all he needed to do was, take 3 days to kind of cool off, take some time aside to just relax and not look at the problem, and then he could come back after 3 days, after some time had passed, with new eyes, and he was able to solve the problem that he had. Now, although that might be good conventional wisdom, that is true, that is not the main message of this story. The main message and theme of this story is one from death to life. So it's an important, kind of very tricky sometimes distinction to make, but there can be other applications that are true, but it might not be the main message of the story. Then number three, does this connection illuminate the literal sense of the text? Are we making sure that the main theme of the story is present? We're not inserting different things into the story that really weren't there in the beginning. Don't have an example for Jonah, but another example that we used 2 weeks ago that Luther brought up about Origen. He was an early church father, and he tried to make this connection that the trees in the Garden of Eden were really referring to the angels of God. Now, there's no real data or anything from the biblical story to justify that connection or to make that assumption. So we want to make sure that basically we're not making things up. We want to stay true to what the text is actually saying. And then lastly, number four, does this connection avoid twisting Scripture for the devil's purposes? So in other words, we just want to make sure that we're not falling into any heresies when we're making these connections. Just don't want to do something that aids the devil's teaching and not our own Christian teaching. So beside these three rules or questions, we actually do have a lot of Christian freedom when we are doing these sorts of exercises. And I think it's also good to keep in mind that, grace does abound, and, it's not something that we have to worry about, like, oh, I'm going to accidentally do a heresy and, God's going to judge me right on the spot. Like, don't worry. If this is something we're doing as Christians in good faith, God's grace is also there for us whenever we mess up, because we're going to do that as well, and that's all right. So with all that being said, want you guys to take some time at your tables, take a couple minutes to make a comparison between the belly of the great fish and Jesus' tomb. So the first connection's probably going to be pretty easy. They were both there for 3 days and 3 nights. Have that similarity right off the bat. But there's other connections to be made as well. Some of these are going to get a little harder, but that's good because we're training our brain to work in a new way when we're comparing these two stories. So go ahead, discuss, and then we'll bring it back together to see what we were able to come up with. All right, let's bring it back together since we just got a little bit more time before the Sunday schoolers will return. So one thing to point out is that even though we have the belly of the fish first in our table and then the tomb second, and you can see how in number 1 of the questions to consider, that's the reverse order of the direction, because there we start with tomb, belly of the fish, you. Here we start with the belly of the fish. It doesn't matter which order these different items are in, as long as you have the arrow going in the right direction. So here the tomb is pointing back to the fish. And what that means then is that we're avoiding errors that you could make, where you could say, if you go in the other direction, you say, like earlier I mentioned, Jonah was alive in the belly of the fish. Then going in this direction, you'd say, well, Jesus was alive in the tomb. Well, that's wrong. That's an error we want to avoid. We want to make sure we go in the other direction so that anything that Jonah tells us about the life of Christ is not going to reveal to us anything different than we already know about Jesus and what has happened. It doesn't reveal new information. It just helps us understand the information that we already know in a deeper and more fuller sense. It's a good teaching tool, and it helps us understand or have a deeper understanding of what occurred. So anyway, with that being said, what are some of the connections that we were able to come up with? Anything to volunteer? Very good, yeah, right from the Apostles' Creed. So Jonah descends to depths of the sea. Jesus descended into hell. Very good. Yeah, they're both making that descent downward. And now there are a little bit of differences between the two. So in Jonah's descent, we see how this is one of both law and gospel, both of judgment against Jonah in his despair, but then also in grace, God uses the fish to ultimately save him from being drowned. Now, Jesus, being perfect, being the God-man, he experiences this descent differently than Jonah does. And really, if Jonah was perfect, how Jonah should have. In the Passion of the Christ, where you have Holy Week leading up to the cross, all the things that Jesus went through in his suffering, that's referred to as the state of humiliation. So that's the beatings and the floggings. Oops, can't spell. Just the being mocked by the guards, and then ultimately being crucified, dying a horrible death. That is the peak of this state of humiliation, and then being laid in the tomb. But then there's this switch, and the descent into hell marks this switch. And now we begin the state of exaltation. So what this means is when Jesus descends into hell, he doesn't descend as one who is conquered. He doesn't go there to suffer. Jesus goes down into hell as the victor. He goes to hell to show that sin, death, and the devil has been conquered. So he doesn't go down to suffer as Jonah does. he goes down to be the victorious king. This marks the start of him being exalted. He goes down in victory. Great. Any other connections? What else is there? Very good. Yeah, so in Jonah's sacrifice, he saves the crew of the ship from the storm that God sent. And then in the same way, Jesus' sacrifice saves much more than just a crew of a ship. Jesus' sacrifice saves the whole world, saves all of creation. Very good. Anything else? Right, yeah, there's this darkness element as well that relate both to going down to Sheol in the belly of the fish. Jesus goes down to hell, a place of darkness as well. Very good. Yeah, one last connection before we wrap up. Also, in a sense, in the gospel sense of the story of Jonah, when he gets spit out and he goes to fulfill what God has actually commanded him to do, there's this sense that Jonah, he dies to his disobedience, even for just a short while, and he's vomited out as a new man that's going to obey what God has commanded him to do. So in the same way, Jesus dies, and he is also resurrected. And then that is given to us in our baptism. The disobedience in us, the sinful self is killed, is drowned, and we are given new life. So what Jonah goes through, what Jesus does for us, this is also ours as well. This is the life of the Christian. Remembering our baptism daily, repenting of sin, dying to it, and living a new life following God's law. All right, very good. So Sunday schoolers, you're back. Please take a moment to go through those quiz questions on the table tents. Those help us determine if we've achieved our goals. So thanks so much. Take a couple minutes with that, and then we will pray the Lord's Prayer to wrap up.